Alright, hello YouTube and welcome to our next little quick tutorial this time. I'm Guardian from Capital Gear Gaming and we're going to be covering rendering and layout for LightWave 11.5. Now, a friend of mine had told me he rendered out a 4-second video and he resulted in a 500 megabyte file. That sounded a bit odd for me, but at the same time it didn't, and there's a few reasons why. So let's just bring our camera up, because we're not really going to be using, this so much, really. We're just going to go into render here, into the render tab. Now, what you want to do is you want to go into render globals, and here you'll see all the settings that you could ever possibly want. You can also access this by having the camera selected and by pressing P, and you'll get the same thing. Now, so let's go over what each of these actually mean if you were to look at these. So we have our range type. Let me put away my headset for a second. So we have our range type. So this is sort of like a the range at which you will render. So from the first keyframe here to the last, which is seen here. So this sort of lets you could almost you could create a very long animation. You could create an hour-long animation, and then by using this you could render out like 10-second segments of it until you have the entire hour-long animation recorded, or rendered out, I mean. Auto frame advanced, personally, no idea. I just leave it on. It's a default option, so left it on. End frame beep, so this one I can see some people using and liking because it kind of tells you when the animation is done rendering. But what this does is at the end of every frame, it will beep. Personally, I don't like that. It sounds horrible. Preview. Now, here's an interesting thing. So here's a preview, and this is a preview image of what is being rendered. Now, there's actually a slight issue with this. Now, if you have a lot of polygons and a lot going on, a lot of physics, whatever, your render is going to be slow. And people hate it when their renders are slow because it's going to be, kind of annoying, basically. So, to those of you out there that have really big animations that take a long time to render, turn this off, because the preview is still taking up your computer's resources. Turn it off and you might see an hour difference. You might not. It depends on what animation you're doing here. So render display also changes things. You can turn that off. You can also try a different type of rendering display, and that might help speed things up. It might slow things down. You might get better quality out of it. It depends. There's Viper. Viper is a automatic rendering system. So if I have, say, a quick particle system set up, give me a second. What am I doing? So if I add in an emitter, which is God nowhere. Oh, there it is. We look at the emitter, and then we attach some hypervoxels to that and activate it. What we can do is, without even rendering the scene, without actually pressing F9 and rendering, without actually rendering the scene, if we move our camera into the right place, which doing it now, we can click on our emitter, and we have to have our hypervoxel box open. I think that helps. I don't know if we actually have to have it open, but it helps, I believe. And if we go over to render and we click Viper, we will see a pre-rendered image of what I'm creating here. So with the particles and the hypervoxels, I've created a just a little basic thing. So if I switch this all of a sudden to say a sprite, you'll notice that under Viper it will change, and it's changed into a sprite under Viper. Obviously, having this in a higher quality setting or a higher resolution will slow down its render. And here's where changing this can change things as well. We can see a particle preview. So this is a full-on particle preview of what we're seeing. We can see a scene preview. So this is what the entire scene looks like. And we can see an object preview. Since we have this emitter selected, we can see it as an object. Now by particle preview, it means once the entire thing is filled with particles. So if I go to here, it should look roughly the same. It might look slightly different. Now, so we've covered that. There's Viper, and you guys know about Viper now. It's just a neat little system that helps you look at what it sort of looks like, because it doesn't render every single little bit of the frame. Otherwise, you might as well just be pressing F9. Instead, it just renders enough so that you can see what it looks like, and it just kind of helps you see what it looks like. So I've used Viper quite a bit, and it's nice. It's nice to have. Limit region, I haven't played with that before, so I'm not too sure about that. Segment memory limit, by default, I believe this is set to 500 or so, and this is how many megabytes each segment of your render is gonna take up in your RAM. And generally, if you have a lot of RAM, you can turn this up. So by default, I think it's around 500, so I turned it up to about 1 gigabyte. Overlay, yes, this would overlay would be so that once you're rendering, it wouldn't tell you. Actually, it's currently off. Yeah, I'm not too sure then. But if you turn it on, you can probably see frame number or time in seconds or whatever. Then we have render options. So here's where things get into what a computer does once it starts looking at a scene, right? So we currently have it set to realistic. Now if we wanted to, we could render everything in wireframe. The render would be insanely fast because there's no polygons involved, it's all wireframe. There's no textures involved because it's all wireframe. So that would be insanely fast. We can have quick shade, which is just polygons, no textures. Again, that would be much faster because textures require your graphics card to do. And then realistic has everything. Now, under here is everything that every animation, video game are made up of. So there's shadows in video games. There's reflections, transparencies, refractions, on collisions, and AA. There's render lines and render instances. So I'll explain what each of these basically are. Hopefully ray trace shadows is pretty generic enough for you guys to understand what that is. That's shadows. So ray trace stands for, it's basically calculating the light. So LightWave has real-time light because it's an animation software. You can't really not have real-time light. And ray trace shadows creates real-time shadows using the lights. And it's the same with reflection. So you get proper reflections based off of the bouncing of light. And transparency, you get proper transparencies through the bouncing and through the passing through objects of light. And you have refractions, well, for light. So these two here are, and this one I guess, no, these two right here, these two ones here are very, very important, because if you have these on, then light will bounce around more, and if it bounces around more, your scene will actually start to look more fleshed out and a lot better. Of course, a scene can only look as good as you make it look, so you know, you can't just click a button and expect your scene to look amazing, but this helps right here. Collision, a lot of people don't quite know what collision is, and that is the collision of two objects at a edge. So imagine having two boxes and they are so close to each other that they are practically touching, or for example a wall and a roof, or a ceiling I mean, and the edges are touching each other. What happens when you turn this on is it will use light to calculate and create a shadow that's created, because if you look in real life at edges where two walls meet or where two objects meet, you'll notice that a shadow is created, and basically that's what this does. However, you have to actually apply this to objects, so this is useless unless you actually apply it to an object, which we'll be going over in a much later episode. But so having this on does nothing by default, because you have to actually apply it to two objects before you can just turn this on and expect it to work. So then there's AA, and there's a lot of people that don't know what AA stands for, and you see it in games all the time because it's obviously important in games just as it is in animation, and it stands for anti-aliasing. A lot of people have seen this, a lot of people have heard of this, and they probably still don't know what it is. Depth buffer AA basically almost double buffers the AA for the animation, and it will make the AA work a lot better. And having this on basically increases the strength of your AA because it doubles it over, and that's how I understand it anyways. It may not be the most correct explanation, but that's how it just basically helps AA. So what is AA? Some of you might be asking. Well, it stands for anti-aliasing. So anti obviously means it's removing, so it's removing aliasing. Now what's aliasing? Well, if you enter a game and completely turn this off, and you look at an edge of an object, like a wall or a faraway cardboard box or anything like that, or if you enter LightWave and you create a box and you turn anti-aliasing completely off, it will create these jagged edges. You can see them here actually. You can see along this grid you have jagged edges going along the entire thing, even though this edge here, this grid, should technically be straight. However, you can see that it's horribly jagged. Like you could run your finger across there and actually cut yourself. Well, that's aliasing, and anti-aliasing blurs that, and as a result it removes it and it makes it look smooth. A lot of people like AA and they use it a lot, so it's also a thing of the past. There are some more intensive, more complex AA out there, but a lot of the AA out there, like MX AA and FX AA, are very weak and they don't do much to your computer anymore these days. So it's nice to turn it on, regardless of what. Render lines, obviously you want to keep that on. If you don't turn on render lines, I believe it just stops you from rendering anything in your scene. Maybe, I'm not too sure about that. It might also be if you change your object to be a certain thickness for its lines, then you can, by turning this on, you can actually see what it's rendering. I did that in a different video, I believe. I just leave that on by default. It's not going to slow your computer down any more or less if it doesn't do anything. Render instances. Now this you can turn off by default, and it's still not going to do anything. But what this does is it allows you to render instances that you've created. So instancing we haven't covered yet, but you can take an object like a cube and instance it so it looks like there's thousands of those cubes, but it'll actually take only seconds to render. recursion limit is how many rays of light the camera is going to shoot out before it stops. And this is tied in with radiosity, so you don't have to worry about that. Ray precision, I assume, I'm not too sure about that, or this. Shading samples, I guess, would be, if you increase this, things are going to get a little bit darker or lighter, and it's going to get a little bit more contrasty. Same with light samples. You know, play around with these settings, I guess, and you can probably find a really good setting for good quality, but I usually keep this at either 6 or 12, and I just leave it as that. I haven't touched this at all, so I'm not too sure what this is. Don't really use it. Light intensity is obviously how powerful your light in your scene is. Flare intensity is how powerful the lens flare in your scene is. Lens flare, if you have this deactivated, you cannot render out lens flares even if your light has one on it. Shadow maps is basically it's basically sort of your shadows almost, but it's not. It's a mapping of the shadows, because it calculates where the light is, and then it calculates where the shadow gets projected. And shadow maps, I believe, helps with that, and it's sort of the calculation part of it. Generally, I just leave that on. Keeps it nice and nice looking. Volumetric lights, it's the same as lens flares. If you have a volumetric light but this is turned off, you will not see it. Noise reduction will reduce any noise. You won't really see that unless you turn on radiosity, so I usually keep that off. Two-sided area lights. Oh yes, so this is an area light. Area lights create very, very soft shadows. They could be a bit of an issue to create, or to use, I mean, and it's just a type of light. So if we go into lights, we can change our light type to area, as you can see, and it's not the best in the world, basically. Where am I? Let me sit down here. So this would change it to just one side. So it would, because an area light creates a light all around it, basically like a sun. That's why it's used a lot as a sun by a lot of the professional LightWave users. So if you turn this off, it would be just one direction. So you could turn it off if you don't want it to create sunlight all around it. That's a personal preference, I guess. Limit dynamic range has to do with the high. You'll notice how everything that's sort of. You'll notice these little lines here, these separators, and they separate like sort of where they belong. So this all has to do with lights and light settings, and there's a separator in between the two areas. So all this stuff that's here has to do with lights. So I know that limit dynamic range has to do with HDR filtering, because it's inside this limitation box. Now what's HDR, some people might ask, is it's high dynamic, I believe it's either high dynamic range or high dynamic rendering. And basically what you do is you use an HDR photo, which is a photo of a chrome ball inside an environment, and it creates a 3D environment for you that all your objects can use their reflection off of, and it basically just creates a really nice looking environment. And I guess that would just limit it, how effective it is. And you can blur it as well, because these are blur options here. Except for that, I don't think that's blurring. I'm not too sure then. So multi-threading. See, I've got it set to 64. You'll have it set to automatic if you haven't played around with this setting yet. And basically, this is how far is it going to push your CPU to render out your thing. So one thread would be the least amount of power that's going to be used. It's probably still going to use up all your CPU gigahertz, but it's not going to quite push it as far. Like if you have, and it depends on how many cores you have too. like if you want the best results, like if you have 4 cores, like I do, you know, you might want to turn it to 4 threads. You know, 1 thread for each core. Or if you have a dual core, you might want to go for 2 threads. But if you want to push your computer sort of past its limitations, then, you know, if you have a quad core, you might want to go with 16 threads. And then you're sort of pushing your computer, and it will render your scene faster. But if you start pushing it too far, it might render it slightly slower. So you might want to play around with that a little bit. I found that setting it to 64 for me kind of worked out pretty well, so I've sticked with it since I changed it. It's probably not the best setting. I'm thinking maybe 32 might be good. I don't know, but it's done me well. It also changes how much of your graphic card it will use, but LightWave is not very graphic card intensive, except for once you get to modeling, so that doesn't really matter. So we have radiosity. So what's radiosity? Well, radiosity is the calculation of light, and it will calculate exactly how light bounces and how many times it's going to bounce. And all these settings here, there's a lot. You have interpolated. Now you want this on default, because if you turn it off, it basically won't cross-section the light properly, and you'll get a bunch of these what are called blotches all over your screen, and it looks really bad. They sort of look like offset shadows. And you have blur background, which, well, it blurs the background for you, which is sort of like a post-process effect, except this one will be calculated by light, so it'll actually be really kind of insane. It'll be really well detailed, and it will be, yeah, like, but it'll take a long time for it to render, so I generally turn that off. A behind test, I'm not too sure what that is, but I assume it's testing the light behind objects in case of that light moving. Because this is all rendered before the frame is rendered, and then the next frame starts up and it renders the radiosity, and then it renders the frame. So the light for radiosity doesn't know if the light's actually going to move, and if it does move, I think this helps calculate it a little bit faster if it's moving, but if it's not, it probably slows it down. So here it's going to be for bumps. I believe that would be it even calculating onto the bumps that you have on your scene. So if you have a texture that has a bump map attached to it, it will calculate how light bounces off that bump map, which is a bit of an interesting way. Directional rays is obviously directional light rays, so it's how the light shoots out of the camera, basically. Volumetric radiosity. Volumetric is like saying I've got water, and then I've got air, and then I've got more water. You know, that would be volumetric, because it's sort of cascading from heavy to light, and then heavy again, or heavy to light to even lighter. So it's got a gradient to it. So it's a lot more detailed, and it's a lot more softer, and it's basically saying it's not going to be just like heavy and that's it, and it's just going to have like basically a sharp line almost. What it's saying is it's basically going to be volumetric, and it's going to go smoothly, because it's going from a heavy area to low density area. That's basically what volumetric means altogether. So you can apply volumetric to all that. Like, for example, if you take your light and you add a volumetric light to it, you'll see the beam, and it starts off really powerful, and then it kind of gradients its way out. Well, that's a volumetric. Obviously, it's going to calculate the light passing through transparent objects, ambient on collision, so it's going to calculate how the light reacts when it hits two walls or two objects that have its edges pressing against each other. Gradients. Sorry, I don't know that one. I haven't used it. Don't need it, I guess. So indirect bounces, so this is one ray of light, that's an indirect bounce. You can have 2 rays of light, or you can have 2,000. The more you crank this up, the more rays of light that are going to shoot out, and it's going to, well, actually no, the more, like if a ray of light hits an object, this would be like a refraction. This would be a indirect bounce. So it wouldn't be like a reflection, it would just be, it would bounce off the edge object, but at a incorrect angle, basically. And the more you do this, the more intensive it's going to become, and your computer is going to slow down. Rays per evaluation, so this is how many specific rays are going to come out and bounce all over your scene. If you crank this up too high, it's going to slow down a lot, but it'll look really nice and really smooth, because if you think about real life, the sun shines down onto us, and it's basically an infinite number of rays bouncing everywhere, all over the place. That's why you can never find a place that is perfectly dark. Like, even if you take a container and perfectly seal it up, by the time you seal it up, a ray of light would have gone in there and it would be bouncing all over the place. So it would not be pitch black. There's no such thing as pitch black, simply because of that rule. Now if we set this to 2, because you have to set it to 2, we can have secondary bounce rays. So this is how many secondary rays there are going to be. By default, I think there's 50. If you have 1, you can set it there. If you set it to more, you can have you know, 1,000 if you want, or whatever. And basically it will make your object look a bit more fleshed out. That's what it does. You know, you can have the angle, so that's angular tolerance. So that's how much the ray of light is supposed to be willing to basically bend, or like reflect off, like what the angle, the limit angle is. This is the minimum pixel spacing that each light has between each other. So if we decrease this, then you have more light that's closer together. Generally I just leave it on that setting. It seems to work just fine. That's obviously the maximum, so it's the same thing as that, but it's the maximum because it's sort of a random amount. They have a multiplier, so if you can multiply it to make it all this stuff seems stronger, even though it's not as strong. They have a cache. This is sort of like pre-render almost. It can help speed up radiosity, is what it does, but it's sort of like a pre-render, and what it does is it will allow, it'll sort of pre-render it, and then it will allow radiosity to calculate sort of like that, and it's called baking radiosity. Acoustics is sort of like I haven't quite gotten into acoustics, but I believe it's sort of like a, I believe it's, I'm not too sure how to explain it, to be honest. I'll have to look more into acoustics to explain it, but I've rarely ever used it, so I probably won't be using it yet. Then you have your camera settings. You know, by default set to perspective camera, but if you're a professional photographer, you have all these different types of cameras that you can use. I just use the perspective, so I won't be going over any of these because I'm not a professional person. You have zoom, which is nice because you might want to adjust the zoom. Now this is the lens focal length. Now the human eye is 17. That's what I learned from one of my teachers anyways. I don't know if he's really correct, but that's what I've been using, and that's what I do use, is 17. You can obviously have a different zoom factor if you want, but you have to sort of remember what the first number was, because I don't remember what the default is, which is a bit of a shame. But obviously changing the lens focal length will change the zoom factor and all that other stuff. So then you can change your resolution. Having a higher resolution will make it take longer to render out. So if you change it to a 4K or 3K, it will take a very long time to render out. If you change it to an Academy, it will take also very long time to render out. I generally use 1280 by 720. When I'm using my test renders, I stick to something small like one of these, like that, or anything else like the default, like 640 by 480. It just doesn't. It will render much faster. We have a multiplier, so we can multiply it. It's basically a zoom factor. Field rendering, I haven't quite dealt with that. Not too sure what it is. Then you can have your own resolution if you want, with its own aspect ratio and everything else. Wouldn't worry about that. So samples, this is an interesting thing. So this is where you actually control the AA. So this is the level of AA. Now, because LightWave is an animation software, it has no limit. A video game has a limit because you can only really have the computer render things in real time so well, right? So there's a limit to how much AA a computer can render out in real time, and also games, they have different powerful types of AA that can basically blur lines a lot more efficiently, and it varies. But if you wanted to, you could go maximum samples and you could set it to 10,000, and then obviously, so that's 10,000 passes over an edge to make sure it's perfectly smooth. And you can add more if you want to. I don't know what that is. 100,000? Oh no, it's way more than 100,000. That's like at least 10 million something or other. And then you have a minimum amount of samples, so you could set that's like 6. And what that says is every object has to either be sampled at 6 or this, or in between. That's what it does. And the computer is basically it's saying what works best, what's going to work best, it'll look at an edge and it'll say what will make this edge look perfectly straight, and it'll decide on a number between here and here. Now 6 is really high. This is ludicrous, and obviously you can't do that because that's weird. You can't have a minimum of 6 and a maximum of 1 because that's just not going to work. You can have 1 1 though. That's possible. Usually I do something like this, because then it's deciding between 1 or 6, and it might go with something like 3. Or if it finds that it's a really jagged edge, it might go with something like 4 or 5. And this has a tendency to work perfectly. And if you find that it is still really jaggedy, what you can do is you can use a reconstruction filter. And this is sort of a cheap way of blurring out everything. And this blurs all the edges. Now you can do a sharp blur, which doesn't really add all that much. So these are all just different types of blurring, and they all do it in a slightly different way. I like using Mitchell, and I use soft. I like using soft because it's a very soft blur, and that would allow me to take this and turn it down to 3, because now I'm blurring everything, just like lazily blurring everything, and it still looks pretty good. Sampling pattern, I haven't really dealt with that, honestly. Soft filter, I haven't really I've used it a couple times. I don't really know what it does. I assume it just helps make things softer. It'll probably slow down your render. I haven't played around with these either, so you can try playing around with these. I assume these are tied into Mitchell Soft or anti-aliasing here, so I've yet to play with those a lot. So here we have motion blur. I'm sure everyone knows what motion blur is, so this is pretty self-explanatory for the most part. A shutter, motion blur passes, blur length, all that. Particle blur, so you can have particles. Stereoscopic rendering is for like 3D movies and stuff like that. You'll notice that it's got a shift here. See? Yeah, wow, it does it even in here. So if we change this, you see you got your blue and your red, and it's for 3D. If you want to create an actual 3D movie. depth of field is used a lot in games nowadays. Obviously, you have your focal length, you have your lens stop, and you have your diaphragm size. I haven't used those. I don't use those very much. I mean, you have to a little bit when you use depth of field, but yeah, I don't use those a huge amount. Then we have our lights. Obviously, those are just the light settings. We've been over those. Then we have where we actually get to rendering our scene, our object, and my God, we've been going for 35 minutes. So we have our type. Now there's a lot of different types. We have AVI, and if you do not do this step, even if you render your animation, it won't actually save, which is really annoying. So you have to make sure you do this step here. Now I usually use AVI, and then I go into options and I set it to full frames uncompressed. Now an uncompressed file can result in a pretty big file. Let me take a look here. For example, if I were to go to my recordings, I've got this explode AVI, and it's 3 seconds, and it's worth 3.62 megabytes. So it's about a megabyte per second, but the thing is, it's absolutely perfect quality, and the reason why is because it's basically it's oh wait, that's not it, is it? No, that's it. What it does is it's uncompressed, which means it's not using any of these codecs to basically take the file and compress it, so it's a smaller file. But when you do that, it will actually lose quality because you're taking that information and you're squishing it down, and well, information doesn't like that. So if you leave it to full frames uncompressed, you get decent size, a second for every megabyte. It's not great, but it's not horrible. I mean, you'd have to go for like an hour of footage would be, I don't know, like maybe 100 maybe 50 gigs. It's hard to say. I'm just kind of lazily thinking up math in my head right now. So you click on that. You can also save it as a photo. So you can save every individual frame as a photo. And the reason why I do want to do that is because if you start saving things as photos, you can save it all as a photo and then put it all together as a as just basically a clip, almost like a flipboard. So basically, if you save something as a photo, what happens is it will save each individual frame. Alright, so what we do here is if you save it as photos, which is RGB, you will what you're basically doing is you're saving each individual frame. So if your render, for whatever reason, stops rendering in the middle of its render, so if it gets to like 2 seconds and it just stops, or if your computer crashes at 2 seconds, as a result the render stops, you will actually not be screwed, because it has saved every single frame up to that point. If you were doing an AVI, then you'd be screwed because that file would be corrupt and it would be automatically deleted. It basically was never created. Occasionally I've encountered an occasion where the AVI somehow survives. I don't know how, but I've encountered that before. And man, look at my RAM, it's been chewed up somehow. I don't know when that happened. I think it's because I'm running Google Chrome as well, and then I'm recording, and then I've got LightWave layout, and then I've got Steam running, and that's a good way to chew up your RAM. So basically, you can save it as pictures, and then you take all those pictures inside a program like Premiere Pro, After Effects, Sony Vegas, and you basically put them all right beside each other, and you set them all to one frame, and you basically re-render out your video with photos instead, and it'll be a lot faster. It's basically, doing it this way is a lot more efficient and a lot faster, but if you're doing just a teeny animation that's like 4 seconds long or maybe 10 seconds long, you know, with not very many polygons or anything like that, you know, AVI is the way to go. It won't take very long. And, you know, if your computer doesn't crash very often, then you shouldn't have issues with doing AVI. So you click on options. I personally prefer full frames uncompressed. You can try different ones, see which one works best. Some of these won't even work at all. You know, I probably have a few that you don't. For example, I might have FFDS show video codec that you don't. I might have Fraps video decompressor because I've got Fraps on my computer. I also have the Lagarith lossless codec. And, you know, you can download these online. You can download these codecs for free. But personally, I just use full frames uncompressed. You get perfect quality. It's a bit of a big file size, but it's not horrible. You want to click on save animation. If you do not click on that, it will not save it, and you have to go animation file, and this is where you can put it wherever you want and name it. And it's the same with all of these. You can set its type, and then you have to click on save, and then if it's unchecked, if it's unchecked and there's nothing set here, and you click on save, it will automatically bring you to this, which is kind of nice. So this is alpha. So an alpha is like a black and white image, like a purely black and white image. It's not grayscale. It's black and white. And basically, this is for if you're going to use overlays. So if you were to create a T-Rex and then have T-Rex destroying buildings, and you wanted it inside of a movie, you know, you would use the alpha to create the T-Rex standing there in the city, basically, and that's how that works. So format, you have different formats. I don't generally play around with those too much. You know, you have color space. I don't really play around with those either. All the alpha format and alpha color space. So linear is like, it's going to be black and then it's going to be white, and that's it. And that's pretty much it. That's all of it. We also have network renders. So this is for render farms. So if you have a bunch of computers, you can connect them all together using ScreamerNet. There are also programs out there apparently, and you can have like up to like 1,000 CPUs working together to render one single scene, which would be awesome. That would be even if the CPUs were at 1 gigahertz, that's 1,000 gigahertz. That's insane. Like, that would also be 1,000 computers. That's a lot. But like, you know, render farms are awesome, but you have to actually, you know, have one. You have to create one, or you can also you can pay for having a render farm online, and you can send people your file and they will render it using whatever program you're using. For there's render farms out there for LightWave, and you can pay people to let you use their render farm, and basically they render it for you, but you have to pay. You have to pay. It's usually a monthly pay or something like that, and it's pretty expensive. The more CPUs you want, the more expensive it becomes. You know about Viper print camera? I think has to do with connecting a physical camera to this camera inside LightWave. It's used for movie producers, so to have a physical camera attached to the LightWave camera, so when you move the real life camera, this camera in LightWave will move. It's apparently really good. I don't know if that's it though. Radioactivity flags, sorry, I don't know what that is. Render queue has to do with the render farm, has to do with network render. What else is there? There's not much else. Cell object, I don't know what that is. NB preview, it doesn't seem to do much, sorry. That's about it, it would appear. That covers just about everything that there is.
If you want to make your scenes look much better, use Radioactivity. Radioactivity is really powerful. Monte Carlo is the more pretty form of Radioactivity. It's more accurate. Final Gather is not as accurate, but it'll make for a faster render, and Backdrop Only is pretty slow. Or I mean, it's fast, but it's not exactly detailed. Like, you can't even get indirect bounces with Backdrop Only. So I hope you guys have enjoyed the videos so far. Please do tune in for more. If you have any questions, please ask. And if you have any suggestions for any future videos, please do tell. And that's how you render in Layout.